role as a caring paediatrician was perfect for George. The fast-paced romp through a hospital emergency room was a new concept that was beamed successfully around the globe.
George Clooney first burst onto the scene in ER, and that's when he first got the nickname Gorgeous George. He played the paediatrician Dr. Doug Ross, and it's not good enough that he was a beautiful doctor. He had to be a child specialist working with kids just to melt your hearts even more.
I think one of the reasons why George Clooney was so successful was that he played a role that was perfect for him. He played Dr. Ross, slightly reassuring doctor, and I think that came over on screen, despite the fact that George himself couldn't even remember his lines or the medical jargon. He had to write it out on little notes around the set for when he was doing his scenes.
ER was a big ensemble show, and there were 7 main actors, but of course the one person most of America seemed to be interested in, especially the women, was George Clooney. He was just one character. He wasn't the most important character very early on, but he soon became it, because Doug Ross was the one that people wanted to read about.
But while his face was becoming recognised as ER's heartthrob, George was also beginning to emerge as a formidable force behind the scenes. On more than one occasion, the morals he'd been brought up with prompted him to speak out. George was becoming known as an actor not to be messed with.
ER was a massive success. Every single member of the cast was on the cover of TV Guide magazine, America's #1 TV magazine. They'd all been on the cover apart from Eric LaSalle, who is the only black member of the main cast. And George went to him one day and said, "How do you feel about this? You've done 5 or 6 interviews with the magazine, you haven't been on the cover." He said, "Well, frankly, George, it is a problem." So George got the whole cast together, and they approached TV Guide, and George, who's a big fan of journalism, said, "We're not going to tell you what to do, we just want to point out what you haven't done. You haven't put the one black member of the cast on your cover."
His efforts were in vain, as the publication denied any wrongdoing, but it established George as a vocal leader in standing up for what seems right. By the late 90s, ER was topping the ratings in America and gaining critical acclaim with an Emmy nomination for Best Drama. George was being spoken of as the star of the show, and the two combined led to interest from one of Hollywood's most successful directors.
His real career started when Quentin Tarantino directed an episode of ER. And Quentin was looking at it with his friend Robert Rodriguez, and he said, "Look at this guy Clooney, look how smouldering he looks, look how brutal he looks, even though he's playing a paediatrician." And from that, Tarantino decided Clooney would be the best person to appear in From Dusk Till Dawn.
I think what's interesting was his first choice from the lovable Doug Ross on ER to the big screen was the Quentin Tarantino written From Dusk Till Dawn. Clooney plays a villain on the run who has to befriend or rather intimidate this family headed up by Harvey Keitel to take him across the border in Mexico. And it's violent, it's very odd, it's not quite right, and Clooney is extremely good. And he's playing it absolutely deadpan. He's playing it with this strange sort of Greek flattened down Gaza haircut, which even looks good on him. It was great. I mean, that is a funny film. That's a cult film, and that was a good break, I think, to kind of get into the swing of Hollywood.
It seemed like the end of a chapter of false starts. By 1996, after 13 years, George Clooney had made it, and ditching the ladies in favour of his dedication to the world of showbiz was paying off. And at 35, George was busier than ever, juggling ER and 2 new roles, Batman and starring in The Peacemaker. But all work and no play has always meant an unhappy George Clooney. On a well-earned break to Paris, escaping the increasingly celebrity lifestyle, he ended up finding romance with a rare lady oblivious to who he was.
I think it was at one of his lowest moments. George decided to take a holiday in Paris, which is probably not the best place to go if you're trying to run away from romance. But it was there that he met the French waitress Céline Balatran, who instantly fell in love with him. He instantly fell in love with her. And a couple of months later, she sold up in Paris and moved into his house in Hollywood.